in a different way. That just threw me off, in a different way than we would if it was just on our own. So stories are an entry point to understanding different experiences of the world. Stories reveal truths, encourage exploration, generate curiosity, and more. They become the connective tissues between time, people, culture, and experiences. So before we begin, I would like to lay out some ground rules as we go into this process. So first things first is active listening. So what that looks like through a virtual setting, which is actually interesting because this I'm so used to doing in person now that this feels a little uncomfortable, which actually is a good thing. So make sure you have your screen muted, so that way we can respect the speaker and not to distract during the presentation. And also, if you are able to, if you can leave your cameras on. As we are virtual, this gives an opportunity for the speaker to feel like you're present and you are a part of the conversation. When the time comes, we do ask if you share that you speak from your own experiences so that you make I statements throughout this process. Do not be afraid to disagree, but do so respectfully, understanding that we'll all have different opinions and perspectives. We do want you to share, but we also want to make sure that we're respectful in this process. Participate by choice. When that time comes and the floor is open, if you have questions, we more than encourage you to do so. We also don't want you to feel any pressure either. Do not invade other stories. So we don't want to have like a one-up situation, as sharing stories can be a vulnerable moment. So we want to make sure we're respectful to those who are doing so. The goal is not to agree, but to gain a deeper understanding. And that goes back to disagreeing, but doing so respectfully, as we can all learn from each other as we all share our own stories. Speak up, but not over. So if someone has the floor, and I know that could be a little more difficult through a virtual setting, but let's be mindful of not speaking over other individuals. And then we ask that you be conscious of body language, especially if you have your camera on. Let's be mindful that the body language that we see can be as offensive as actual language at times. So let's be mindful of that. All right, so I will now pass the floor to Keisha Booker, the Assistant Director in the Office of DEIB, to introduce our speaker. Keisha, if you're speaking, we can't hear you. And just as we have to sometimes do in this virtual space. So Dr. Williams, I do not have your introduction in front of me, so I will just ask if you do not mind with our technical difficulties, if you can just introduce yourself and begin your presentation.
All right. My name is Dr. T. Leon Williams. I have served in higher ed for more than 20 years. I have a rich background in multicultural affairs. Throughout that time, I've had the blessing to travel the country and teach the ideology of nonviolence and what Dr. King adopted from people such as Gandhi. I have, in the early 2000s, I was able to create a monologue, and that has traveled with me for more than 20 years now. So every college campus that I have the opportunity of visiting, I share in monologue the voice of Dr. King and what he would have to say today. So if you be patient with me, I want you to join me in heart and spirit as I go into monologue of the one none other than the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I would like to thank Dr. Anthony Jones for his invitation. I would also like to thank Ms. Amber Holmes for her attention to details. And lastly, I would like to thank Slippery Rock University for giving me the opportunity to share with you in this season. Ladies and gentlemen, family and friends, many years have passed since I commenced to writing you. My hesitation is because I have fallen victim to my own critique. Silence has become my personal call to action. I must confess that silence has weakened my spirit. At times, I feel like a man without conviction, which is hazardous to the movement. But the movement requires a firm forward lean in the march for justice. Since you last heard from me, systemic racism, police brutality, social inequality, political and cultural infighting has not slowed its pace of destruction in this nation. Injustice and other disparities have cemented its footing in unrest. Our cause and our fight have become mere strangers, meaning we no longer enter in the noble fight or advocate for the worthy cause. Instead, we fight against ourselves to an unrecognizable moral end. This is unflattering in an unflattering nature. Coupled with the stillness of heart, it is the greatest crime of the 21st century. Like many civil rights leaders of old, I recline in my seat of fairness and justice, only to learn that a rested soul can lead to complacency. And when matched with cynicism and discontent, restlessness pushes the edge. It did not take long for me to understand that discontent is the result of compassion fatigue unchecked, which perpetuates angry silence. Honestly, I find it fascinating to be a witness of my own dying love of hope. With exhaustion and frustration staring me in the face, silence has found me. I did not find it. Surprisingly, silence attracts the liking of others. Those across the aisle share a similar silence. The primary difference is that the silence that I speak of examines who is suffering, whereas power brokers show their support for those who suffer less. Clearly, we all suffer, but not all suffering is the same. While some suffer for others, there are many who suffer from self. Suffering for others involves love and empathy, whereas suffering from self involves greed and power. Suffering for other places the lives of others before your own, but suffering from self places the self above all others. Suffering from self is an interesting phenomenon. Suffering from self is self-regulated, which means those in power determine the punishment and the privilege. America is guilty of suffering from self. And with the aid of silence, suffering from self is no bother to the elite. Suffering in silence has been America's double-edged sword of justice, meaning our cause and fight has proven favorable as well as unfavorable, leaving no comfortable seat at the table. Regardless of your affiliation, regardless of your party line, regardless of your gender, race, lifestyle, creed, or religion, the unprecedented moments of suffering and silence are breathtaking. Suffering and silence undergird police brutality. Suffering and silence undergird human trafficking, drug trafficking, global health issues, poverty, and poor access to health care. Those who advocate for peace and justice and those who oppose peace and justice find themselves in America in a tug of war over suffering and silence. The problem is that both groups are pulling on the same side of the rope, divided in spirit and divided in truth. This is not a strategy for victory in this country. This is a violation of societal norms and standards, which leads to self-defeat and moral tragedy of self-destruction, leaving no room for restoration and redemption. Suffering and silence has allowed those in positions of leadership to intentionally go against what is right, what is best, and what is needed. It is obvious to me that silence needs nothing more to compass its end. Silence secretly travels with good men who look on and do nothing. Silence allows wrong to be committed, even if it endangers our highest ranking authorities and public officials. To my surprise, evil is not silence desired end. The threat of evil combined with coercion and cooperation are silence desired end. Even more preposterously, silence never troubles himself to use his heart and mind to fight for the rights of others. Silence uses the right towards the freedom of speech to not speak. Some time ago, I considered this behavior to be accidental, but I was mistaken. This behavior is intentional and oftentimes premeditated, which means a representative of silence sponsored a bill. Silence was agreed upon and a vote was cast. The real problem is that silence never intended to speak, never intended to negotiate. Silence never intended to reach across the aisle. The only motive for silence is to remain anonymous, because anonymous silence allows the silencer to sign on and sign off whenever it is convenient. Silence not only lives and breathes on American soil, silence can be seen elsewhere. World leaders, both far and near, have used silence to impose war and violence on the weak. And those who, with close ties to silence, remain muted to secure their own freedom. In this context, silence is regarded as a tool of avoidance, and avoidance allows the bystander to escape difficult decisions without guilt or shame. Although it may seem like silence is a choice, it is my belief that silence is not a choice. Silence is a system. Silence is a culture. Silence is a mindset. Silence is a behavior. Silence is a posture that makes a choice for you, which is the real reason why many hide behind silence. Many feel that if silence makes the choice for me, there is less pressure to announce my heart connection to peace and justice. So silence has its own way of kidnapping what is right and what is moral. Another shared perspective is that silence is the key ingredient for planned revolts or rebellion. Unfortunately, we are very familiar with this level of silence. 1 year ago, revolt and rebellion sounded the trumpet of insurrection. The goal of the insurrectionists is to hide while others are seen and heard. The fingerprints of those who incite injustice are never found on the bullhorn. Insurrectionists never show their hands to the public. Instead, they wipe their hands clean from cooperation. The insurrectionist speaks first and laughs last. The insurrectionist provokes, probes, and push, but cowardly and conveniently circumvent any involvement or responsibility. And those who sit on the sidelines find comfort in just cheering. The danger of silence is that silence matures not by the years, but by the affiliates. Participatory silence moves away from the shadow of guilt to the shadow of indifference. American silence has allowed participants to act independent of humanity, independent of morality, independent of peace, and independent of justice, which means silence uses its own judgment without consideration of others. The danger here is that silence can effectively act alone and in groups. Some of the greatest threats to silence are speaking out, fighting for justice, and embracing diversity, equity, and inclusion. Regretfully, racism, discrimination, and segregation has kept pace with the momentum of diversity talks. The number of diversity, equity, and inclusion trainings are well documented, but equally represented are the number of acts of unfair treatment, bias, and racism. For decades now, diversity, equity, and inclusion has attempted to close the gap on the exploitation of human difference of all forms. So it goes without saying that diversity, equity, and inclusion speak passively to fair and just practices and policies. Although DEI checks the box of inclusivity, much like the Rooney Rule in American football, DEI does not address upward mobility. This is where silence has found its new home. Upward mobility, in simple terms, permits those in the funnel to change their status frequently. The problem in America is that only a select few make it in the funnel, leaving others to force their way in the funnel unsupported. Silence has a way of limiting support by withholding information. Upward mobility has very little force without upward communication. If lost in translation or barriers are put in place, upward communication can change the trajectory of your desired end. Research has found that upward communication is rewarding only if the correct information is made easily accessible. This is not the case for those who historically climbed and have fought their way through racism and discrimination. Family, several weeks ago, I was speaking with some political leaders, and I realized that many fail to believe that silence is an action. Silence, if you sit on the sidelines, silence is a vote. Without slogans and signs, silence is a protest without words. Silence has a way of deciding for others what is just and what is equal. But be aware of silence. Silence, warm embrace does not come without caution. For those who choose silence over advocacy, know this: quiet voices are not always harmonious. Unexpressed thoughts and opinions routinely perpetuate segregation. Silence finds the guilty not guilty and the aggressor unashamed. Silence stands before the judge and jury with very little regret. Silence doesn't choose a party line chooses silence. Our country has watched quietly as those in power make decisions that benefit a select few. I refer to these type of leaders as agitators of peace and justice because they sign blank checks to fund corruption. Any financial assistance, public or private, designated to fund corruption stifles economic and developmental growth. Our nation is swamped with entitlement and privilege, which are two beneficiaries of silence. As the next generation of leaders, I charge you to fight against silence. We have a long-standing history of fighting for justice. We have a long-standing history for fighting for peace. We have fought for those who are hungry and fought for those who are sick. We fought for those living in poverty and those without permanent housing. Today, we must fight against silence, fight against bystanders and onlookers, fight against silent partners and partnerships. No longer can silence speak silently. No longer can silence stand in its own shadow. No longer can silence share the stage with inner voice. Several years ago, we faced arguably our deadliest pandemic in world history. Here at home, we suffered tremendous heartache and loss. Our nation was devastated as we searched for answers and remedies and alternatives. My heart goes out to the families who experienced direct loss. I have prayed and will continue to pray for those who serve as essential workers, such as doctors and nurses and paramedics. Unfortunately, we continue to suffer from sickness and disease. The virus has taken on many forms and strands. It seems like when one problem is solved, then emerges another. Currently, we wrestle with respiratory viruses that do not discriminate. Every man, woman, boy, and girl is at risk. So many of us are left with mixed emotions, but while we heal, we also hurt. Ironically, this is the same truth that has plagued our nation for centuries. While we heal, we also hurt. Attempting to heal while hurting doesn't allow time for full recovery. In fact, hurting robs you of healing. We have race relation wounds that never heal, anti-Semitic wounds that have never healed, gender different wounds that have never healed, religious different wounds that have never healed, all because we continue to hurt. And silence extends hurting, which prolongs healing. In a sense, silence is criminal because it is connected to a greater crime of negligence, and over time, negligence leads to permanent wounds that leave lasting effects on race relations, healthcare, mental health, and gender equity. The moral welfare of our nation is trending downward. Silence has compromised our ability to discern right from wrong. Silence has taken the breath out of hope. Along the Mississippi River, down in the Delta, folks are losing hope. In the low country of South Carolina, sons of former slaves are losing hope. In the heartland of America, Iowa folks and farmers are losing hope. But I refuse to remain silent for much longer. All hope is not lost. Now is the time for America to thread the needle to mend hopelessness. Now is the time to stand in opposition of silence. The time is right and the time is now to engage in problem solving. Now is the time to divorce ignorance. Now is the time to clear our throat from the mucus of hate and commit our hearts to exposing the bullhorn of bigotry. The only way to break silence is by involving the heart. Silence is a heartless condition. The trouble I've seen over the last 50 years is that silence has permeated every community, every local government, every household, every school board, every hospital, and every prison. Silence has even ushered silence into the church. Silence is not a way to lead the country forward. For decades, silence restricted people from starting the race. But since the glass ceiling has been broken, silence restricts people from finishing the race. This is done by moving the finish line. As a result, many have been in the race longer than expected, while others have ran the race twice. Silence has made it difficult to succeed at doing good, forcing many to add supplements to their performance. Silence is a moving target because silence has exchanged hands over the years from one generation to the next. Silence has traveled through the depths of slavery, to the Jim Crow laws, to the civil rights, to mainstream media. Silence has made its way from the slave plantations, to prisons, to railroads, to construction sites. Silence has not suspended its courtship with lynchings, town hall meetings in Congress, and it does not plan on abandoning its posts at homeless shelters, food pantries, and bus stations. If you look closely, silence can be found everywhere. Silence can be found in police brutality. Silence can be found in sex trafficking. Silence can be found in economic corruption. Silence can be found in housing discrimination. Silence can be found in labor laws. Silence can be found in sweatshops and factories. Silence is not hard to find. Silence lives in places where disparity and oppression exist. If you look and find inequality, you will find silence. If you look and find discrepancies, you will find silence. If you look above or below poverty, you will find silence. Silence has moved beyond policies and procedures. Silence is a code of conduct. Silence has become part of our value system. Standards are established with silence in mind. Silence is an expected behavior amongst those who belong. Silence doesn't rely on ethics and good intention because that empowers the members of the community. Instead, silence sets the rules for unity, direction, and rebuttals. Silence continues to reinvent itself. Silence signs the check for new business. Silence is the fog that blurs seeing gentrification and displacement. Silence is the partner that does not evict you, but does raise the rent. Silence is the opinion to add a new business district in an unstable financial community. Silence revitalizes a community, not caring what kinds of people are being displaced or how they fare post-displacement. Silence carries the torch of inevitability, meaning silence is systematic and structural. In this regard, silence is a characteristic finder that preys on ignorance while restricting opportunities for advancement. The real danger with silence is that it can be intentional and unintentional. Both methods have proven to be effective, and many have suffered from silence's deception. Silence attraction is the whole and not the part. Silence does not hunt for one individual. Silence sees the individual as a social phenomenon. The reason being is because silence stops categorizing who exists in the world or who takes up space in this world. Instead, silence observes the interplay between community and society. Particularly, silence examines the Black community. Silence examines the poor community, the homeless community. Silence examines the gender community. It looks at the farming community, the working community, the church community. Silence takes a close look at the senior community. Silence also reflects the lives of college students. So they're looking at the college student community, the buyer community, the prison community, healthcare community, homosexual community, business community, and more. Several months ago, I was invited to join a panel of other community leaders, and the question was asked, what were the failures of the civil rights movement? I replied, there is no single failure attached to the civil rights movement. In other words, the civil rights movement has not experienced failure. The many lives that travel both far and near to take action for all of humanity is not failure. The number of supporters who walked away from their jobs and their freedoms to confront racism and poverty and bigotry, that's not failure. The nonviolent lunch counter sit-ins, protests, and other demonstrations, that's not failure. Resistance to strike back and the restraint to not commit violent acts is not failure. The lives sacrificed and the lives lost, that's not failure. Fighting for the right to vote is not failure. Fighting for the right of women is not failure. Advocating for equality, equity, and fairness, that's not failure. Organize temporary relief for those in need, I don't see it as failure. By definition, failure can be described as a lack of success or the inability to meet an expectation. The reason why some question the impact of the civil rights movement is because its impact was not felt immediately. The strength of the movement is its longevity. The movement has no end. The civil rights movement shed light on a dark world. The movement made public the horrific crimes and violence unleashed on men, women, and children. If there was a sense of letdown, the disappointment was seen in the behavior of the aggressors. Our nonviolent protests, which at times was a silent protest, rarely spoke louder than violence being received or witnessed. Until America was able to see the lynchings in Alabama, until America was able to see the Jim Crow laws in Georgia, until America took witness to the segregation of schools in Arkansas, until America was able to see the lunch counter sit-ins and the atrocities there in the Carolinas, America was asleep. It took the exposure of crime and violence for America to wake up. None of our protests perpetuated violence. These were nonviolent acts of protest, and at times silent acts of protest. Sometimes when we came together for a protest, we sang hymns. Other times we kneeled and prayed. We even put our hands behind our back and put tape over our mouths. Tears running down our face, mixed with streams of blood from police brutality. That's not failure. No time to lick our wounds because of the ferocious dogs attacking us. That's not failure. As we stood helplessly, the relentless avalanche of water that blasted our bodies, throwing us from one side of the street to the other. That's not failure. We determined at that moment that something needed to be done. Something needed to be said. Through the hurt and the tears, the people needed hope and America needed help. The March on Washington was a moment in history, a slight pause in public violence, a moral booster and character builder. We wore our best and presented our best self. The March on Washington was the injection that we needed. Through its anger and hostility, hate and regret, America had to see America for itself. America realized that it was heartless and loveless. But since the March on Washington, the medication that we call love has been met with resistance. All my years, I wanted nothing more than to love this country. Our kindness and patience has been met with the sense of urgency to regain the slave. Our forgiveness has been trampled over. In the 1970s and 80s, Black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestant and Catholics resigned from their silence and said no more. No more will I watch the horrendous acts of violence in silence. No more will I agree with segregation and bigotry in silence. Surprisingly, this position, even on the other side of the aisle, has been met with some struggle. A group of silencers within have reintroduced themselves to society. They have new locations, new names, new ways to communicate. They're not called the KKK. They have new thinking, new weapons, new tactics, and new supporters. Sadly, they use old money, old hate, old slogans, old power, and the same old greed. The infighting for our brothers and sisters across the aisle has caused division amongst the ranks of the oppressor. The moral combat within of what is right and acceptable has caused the oppressor to further divide its empire, but yet stay in power. Please understand, this is not a lesser power. This is a wider power because it further attracts like-mindedness. My greatest fear has come to fruition. The oppressor's silence has been broken while the oppressed silence has ran out. At the turn of the century, the movement that once stretched its arms wide in love, that once humbled itself in the face of hate and bigotry, the movement that stood and kneeled in harm's way, the movement that asked for peace in the midst of war, the movement that prayed for its abuser and kneeled before its accuser, the movement that survived deception and manipulation now stands tall, unveiled, confident, proud, and secure. More importantly, the movement doesn't stand alone. The movement today will not wait for man's grace and mercy. No, the movement today does not walk in fear. Today, the spirit of the movement lives. This generation, all of you, leaders will refuse to kneel in silence. I understand that. You're going to refuse to watch silently as police brutality unfolds. I understand that. This generation of leaders will not tolerate hate and bigotry. This generation will not extend a warm embrace to those who set fire to wooden houses. It's a new day in the civil rights movement. It's a new day in education, a new day in leadership. It's a new day on the war on drugs. It's a new day in politics. Family, it's a new day in America. Today, when silence speaks from the mountains of New Hampshire to the shores of California, today, the voices of oppression sing glory, glory, hallelujah. His truth is marching on. Once upon a time, silence raged war on the oppressed. Today, silence has to release its hold on the oppressed. Not long ago, silence walked in the shadow of hatred and bigotry. Today, silence must walk alone. Will you join me? Will you join me in the fight for freedom and justice? Will you join me in our climb for peace? Will you join me in dismantling corporate power? Will you join me in the continual integration of schools? Will you join me in exposing separate but equal, knowing separate never was equal? Will you join me in protecting our children in schools? Will you join me in balancing the books of healthcare? If we are to be a great nation, a nation of promise and value, a nation of honest dialogue and protection, a nation that serves its members with truth and integrity, we must speak louder than silence. We must shoulder the responsibility of challenging silence. It is impossible to outlive silence, but it's not impossible to outweigh silence. One day along the coastal shores of the Carolinas, one day near the Alleghenies of Pennsylvania, one day in the rice fields of Louisiana, folks of all nations will share one language and one culture, and that is love. Love breaks silence. Love has a way of touching the heart and soul of silence and transforming it into an oasis of freedom and justice. Love keeps the country moving forward. It is only when love stops that silence catches its breath to continue on. Love helps break silence between the haves and the have-nots. Love is the meeting place for grace and mercy. Love washes the hands of betrayal. Love cleans the hearts of hate. Love filters the words of manipulation, and love warns against war. Love is not desperate. Love is not needy. Love wants nothing more than to be love. Love lives on the mountaintop and in the valley lows. Love makes the crooked places straight. Love blindfolds racists and defunds segregation. If I said this once before, and I'll say it again, we would have to repent in this generation for the hateful word, not for the hateful words of the evil people, but the appalling silence of the good people. I can't thank you enough, Slippery Rock, for allowing me to spend this time with you, to continue to fight for freedom and justice. I am so glad that God has given me the opportunity to witness such an August moment in history. I want you to know that we don't have to sing free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last. No, we don't have to sing that anymore, because we are free. Now our hearts must sing a new song, a song that hope is its trajectory, a song that doesn't overpromise, but doesn't underserve, a song meaningful for Blacks as well as for whites, a song that can be sung in Iowa as well as in Oregon, a song that can be sung in Ohio as well as New York, a song that reaches the farming land as well as the suburbs, a song that reaches the slums and ghettos as well as the fancy places in Florida, the song that stretches across the aisle. This song is our new song. Over my head, I see freedom in the air. That's our song. Every time we look up, no matter what is hovering over us, realize that over my head, I see freedom in the air. Thank you.
Thank you. Can we give Dr. Williams a virtual round of applause? Thank you. Thank you. So I definitely want to open it up to questions as long as we have time. But before we do so and people start to log off, just wanted to give you some updates on future programs that will be coming out of our office. So through the Leadership Development Institute, January 25th, next Wednesday at 2 p.m. and the Smith Center 322 will be doing a understanding bias training from 2 to 3 p.m. So we would love for you to be there. This is a faculty staff only event because we want to provide a space for faculty and staff to be free, make mistakes and so forth. So we would love to see you there. And then our next Power of Stories, the importance of seeking mental health services, will be February 16th at 5 p.m. And that will be another Zoom event that will be presented by Bertha White and moderated by Dr. Jennifer Culver. So at this point, I do want to open the floor up to anyone that may have questions for our speaker, Dr. Williams.